Welcome to Ethics Hour on ESDN, your only place for up-to-the-minute coverage on everything ethics in sports. With me, as always, I have Jack Hamilton and Zach Gregg. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about sports reporters voicing opinions on politics outside of sports. Recent prominent figures like Jemele Hill and Bob Costas have come under fire for voicing their own political opinions. Jack, let me turn to you for a second. Can you explain to me more about the Jemele Hill thing and what's going on there?
Yes, I can. So, basically, as we know, Jemele Hill was a reporter for ESPN SportsCenter at 6, pretty prominent figure. And then once the whole Trump administration came into power, she was voicing her opinions, pretty strong negative opinions about President Trump on her Twitter. ESPN considered that a violation of their social media code of conduct, and basically let her go. She claimed that she left for personal disagreements, but the issue comes down to her voicing her opinions as a sports journalist on social issues, which, again, is the issue at hand here.
So to be clear, the things that she was saying on Twitter weren't about sports at all?
Not even somewhat related to sports. They're mostly just her opinions on social issues, which people have their different opinions on. It's kind of a hot topic at the moment. And that's what we're here to discuss today.
Thank you, Jack. And I want to turn to you, Zach, now. We're going to go back a few years to Bob Costas, another instance in which a sports reporter came under fire for going away from the general sports topic. What happened there?
So what happened was on a broadcast of Sunday Night Football, Bob Costas used his... Well, a little bit of background first. There was a murder-suicide involving an NFL player, and a few days later, Bob Costas used his platform on the halftime report of Sunday Night Football to essentially advocate for gun control. And it's one thing to use the halftime report to give your thoughts and prayers and condolences to the specific sports-related incident, but he took it a step further, and he brought advocacy into it, and he voiced his own personal opinions, and in my opinion, there's no place for that in sports journalism. He took it to a whole nother level, and it's one thing if he was a pundit on CNN, then maybe it's acceptable for him to say these kind of things. But he was doing the halftime report of a football game, and people don't tune in to Sunday Night Football to see Bob Costas telling everyone that guns are bad. That's not his job, and that's not his title, and it's just completely irrelevant and somewhat absurd to me.
So this brings us into a larger discussion about whether or not sports journalists should be engaging in political discourse outside of the sports world. There are some people who say that sports journalists should be simply sticking to sports and that they should be leaving the politics to those in the politics department. They say that sports should be sports and nothing more. Well, there are some people, on the other hand, that think that because sports reporters have a platform, they're free to talk about whatever they like. They're free to talk about politics in their sportscasts as well as sports. With me here, I have Jack and Zach, who each have their own opinions about what sports reporters should do. So, Jack, let me just start off basic for you. What role do you think that politics should play in a sports reporter's cast?
Okay, so like you mentioned, I am of the belief that sports reporters should be able to report on politics or speak about politics if that's something that they're inclined to do, because these issues, just because you're a sports reporter or an athlete, it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to you. And with the platform you have as a sports journalist, that's somewhere where you can reach people that a lot of others wouldn't be able to, and you have a platform and a voice. If you feel a certain way about a certain issue, be it sports, politics, anything else, you should be able to speak that way.
All right, fellas, I'm going to cut off our discussion right there, actually. I think that there's clearly a lot to say, and you guys have said quite a bit about our ethical dilemma here, which is that the question of whether or not sports reporters should be talking about politics in their broadcasts. Jack, you've said a lot about how you think that sports reporters should have the freedom to do that, while Zach, you've argued pretty adamantly that sports reporters should stick to sports. I'm actually going to turn to some of our interviews now that we're going to bring in over the phone. We have some pretty big people lined up for us today. First of those is the sports editor of the New York Daily News, Eric Barrow. So, Eric, as a journalist, where do you stand on the debate between Bob Costas and Jemele Hill? What are your initial thoughts on the controversies that's going down?
Well, I think it's especially with Jemele Hill. I mean, she's basically being paid by ESPN to be a voice to express her opinions on various issues, and I don't think the presidency and how the presidency has basically impacted the NFL and some of the things that the president said about players. I think she should have the freedom to be able to express what she wants to express, especially as she did it on social media.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for joining us. Wouldn't you say that for a sports reporter to voice their opinions on political matters or anything really unrelated to sports, wouldn't you say that that's sort of unethical?
I don't think you could say that they were being unethical. I mean, I think you, just as anyone else, that they're entitled to their opinion. More in the case of Jemele Hill, I mean, her sort of platform at ESPN. When she was first on the show His and Hers, her position on that show was to express her opinions, especially on issues of social justice, Black Lives Matters, race in sports. So I don't think that I say that's unethical. I think her job in covering the news was sort of morphed into, which is a lot of what we do here at my paper, the Daily News, is we have what I call essentially beat columnists. You go cover a beat, but you do it from a perspective of we want to hear your impressions of this team, and I want more, not so much about the whens and the whys and the hows and all that is all important. But I also want our reporters to come out with their interpretations and their feelings and their thoughts to essentially be columnists. And I think that's sort of what Jemele Hill is, what she was doing when she was on the Six. She was reporting the news, but she was also expected to bring her own point of view and her own perspective to her covering of the news. Sports has been given an avenue to so many political discussions throughout. I mean, you got to go back to whether it's Muhammad Ali or the 1968 podium with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, or even going back to Jesse Owens. There's sport there. You do have your sports subject, but if there's a bigger issue going on behind that, whether it's with Jesse Owens, it's Nazi Germany or the treatment of blacks at that time, or the same thing with the 68 games and the protests, the athletes that were considering boycotting and then expressing themselves on the podium. Sports can give an avenue to those issues and bring them to an audience that might not be willing to listen to those perspectives, other than through folks that they now recognize, and it's now in their face.
All right, thanks again for joining us, Eric. Next on the phone, we have George Vesey, who has been a sports columnist for over 50 years, most recently with the New York Times, and has written numerous books about politics and sports. Hi, George. So, just as a general, what role do you think politics should play in the sports world?
I do think that for the more responsible networks, and I would certainly include ESPN, in that, I don't necessarily think that their people should be writing about the president, even if you're, angry or politically aroused on it. I don't think that the kind of Facebook or Twitter bombast is necessarily appropriate from somebody that's going online, or going on television, or going on a website with millions of followers. And let's be real, they do. I mean, they're the ones who reach a lot of people. I think that a network or a website has a certain responsibility, the bigger you are, to try not to tick off, 40%, 60% of your following, you owe it to be. Now, if there's a real issue involved, if Trump said something, if it was a Kaepernick issue, if it was a freedom of speech of an athlete, or Trump saying these guys are losers, or I'm not going to invite a punk like that to to the White House, whatever the reason, whatever the underlying stuff behind it was, which I don't even remember, but I do think that ESPN and other networks have, and most of the time do recognize. So my guess is it probably is not a bad idea to say to somebody, you can't do that, and we're going to take a few steps to look into that in the short run about what you're doing, or try and keep you from being overly political, unless it's an issue that you can write about by talking to other people. But people do have the right. I mean, if somebody says something and it's in a sports domain at all, even criticizing a Kaepernick or something, or rights that move over into the sports area, and race certainly does. Things that happen in a town in Missouri, or a town in Trayvon Martin, suddenly do make an awful lot of athletes uncomfortable about what their lives or families' lives, or how endangered they are. So I can understand why people thinking about that, and I do too. I have much more freedom now in retirement, but I do understand a network like like ESPN, or certainly good newspapers like the Times and the Washington Post, from letting people go crazy about it. And on the other hand, you really don't want to hold back columnists either from having opinions on things where it does go into politics and sports.
In your opinion, you think that these sports journalists should remain neutral in reporting athletes' coverage and not drop in their own opinion?
In the news, I don't think it's the reporter's job is to report, and whatever people want to say. I mean, the fake news charges on both sides. Everybody now wants to say fake news, but the good papers are still insisting that their reporters do their homework, come up with stuff, and don't start writing words until you know some of the both sides and the facts to it.
All right, thanks again, George, for coming on with us today. Lastly, we have Kevin Connors, who is an ESPN anchor, former colleague of Jemele Hill's, and an Ithaca College graduate. Kevin, what are your thoughts on the issues we've discussed today?
If you're asking me as a reporter, as an anchor, as a journalist, what role do I think giving my opinion? I don't think that it belongs in anything that I do unless I'm asked about it. If someone says to me, "What's your opinion on something?" And if it's on the air, I probably would shy away from it myself, because I'm someone who reports facts and stories. I'm not an opinion giver. And that line's been blurred especially on my network, by people who are opinion givers, who have come on SportsCenter or have hosted SportsCenter. But in the general sense, I think on-air people, reporters, journalists, it's not their position to give opinions. It's their job to present facts and let people form their opinions based on that.
So, Kevin, last question. Personally, you worked with Jemele Hill. And so I guess first, for you personally, would you subscribe to the philosophy that it is okay to put your political beliefs out there, or would you put your political beliefs out there? And second, what happened with Jemele, and why would some people consider it a problem?
Again, that's up to the individual. I can tell you what I go by. I whenever possible, and there are gray areas for me. I'm not talking this in the literal sense 100% of the time, but I am talking that when it comes to political things. I'm not afraid to tell people that I'm a Bills fan, and I say that on the air. I probably, if I was being literal about not giving my opinion on things, I probably wouldn't do that. But when you're talking about political issues that can be divisive, I don't subscribe to that. It's just not my thing. Now, Jemele's in a weird place, because Jemele is a reporter sometimes, was a Sports Center anchor, but I think I'm in line saying that her trade would be largely an opinion giver or a social commentator. So she was kind of in this spot where she was put in there based on what her bread and butter is, and then people got upset when she would give those opinions. So in a long-winded way, me personally, I don't subscribe to being an opinion person. I just don't do that. That's not what I'm good at, nor I want to be good at. But in her case, she felt that was kind of a platform or maybe a responsibility that she had.
Thanks, Kevin. So to recap today, we've had a brief discussion about the ethical dilemma in the realm of sports journalism that has to do with whether or not sports journalists and pundits should be voicing their political opinions in their sports broadcasts. We've had people from both sides of the row, people who have said that sports journalists should stick to sports, and those who have said that sports journalists should be able to voice their own opinions. Now, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. You can follow us on our respective social medias for more on the discussion. ESDN will be running programs throughout the week. But don't change the channel, because coming up next, we have Fantasy Sports Hour with our very own host, James Murphy. See you tomorrow.